Hello, welcome to tonight's story. Step back with me into 1692 Salem, Massachusetts, where paranoia and Puritanism collided in a deadly storm of superstition, power, and fear. In this immersive four-part series, we go far beyond the textbook summary and uncover the overlooked details, human stories, and devastating truths behind the Salem Witch Trials. But before we begin, if you could leave me a comment, I would love to hear where in the world you are tuning in from and what time it is for you now. It is always fascinating to know who is joining me from around the world. And if you enjoy what I do here, please give a like and subscribe. It would mean the world to me. Now, let's get settled in and begin. Imagine you're waking up in a small timber-framed house. The fire has long gone cold. The air bites at your skin. Outside, the ground is frozen, the trees bare, and the sky a dull, unwelcoming grey. This is Salem Village, 1692. Not the romantic New England of Thanksgiving tales and white steepled churches, but a raw, hard-scrabble settlement full of tension, suspicion, and fear. You are a Puritan, part of a deeply religious community where every moment of life is seen through the lens of sin and salvation. You believe the devil walks among you. You fear that any misstep, any blasphemous word, missed Sabbath, or strange dream might be proof you've fallen from grace. Life is hard here. Food is scarce. The winters are long. Disease comes swiftly. Death, even for children, is never far. In a town of only about 600 people, everyone knows everyone else's business. Resentments fester. Land disputes erupt over stone walls and grazing rights. Family names carry reputations, both proud and damning. There is little room for error and even less for outsiders. In January 1692, something strange begins in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams begin acting wrong. They shriek. They writhe on the floor, they speak in tongues and complain of being pricked by invisible needles. They huddle in corners, eyes wide with terror, pointing to things no one else can see. Reverend Parris, stern and unbending, is horrified. A physician is called, but he cannot explain the girls' behaviour. Finally, in a diagnosis that would ignite a firestorm, he says they are afflicted, not with illness, but with witchcraft. And just like that, the fuse is lit. Why here? Why now? The seeds had been planted for years. Salem Village was embroiled in a bitter feud with neighbouring Salem town. Wealthy merchants to the east, humble farmers to the west. The village had recently built its own meeting house and hired Reverend Parris, but not everyone supported him. He was divisive, demanding, and known for preaching hellfire and damnation from the pulpit. In this small world, power was fragile and fear was potent. There had been whispers of witchcraft before. Superstition ran deep. Children were taught that Satan was real, that he could tempt, possess, and corrupt. Women in particular were seen as spiritually weaker, more susceptible to the devil's influence. It wasn't a matter of if the devil would strike, but when. So, when Betty and Abigail began convulsing and others soon followed, Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, the community was primed to believe it was witchcraft, and they were desperate to root it out. Under pressure to name the source of their torment, the girls began to accuse. They named 3 women: Tituba, the enslaved woman of Reverend Parris; Sarah Good, a destitute beggar who muttered to herself and scowled at passers-by; and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who rarely attended church. 3 women who didn't fit Salem's mould of godliness. 3 women on the fringes of society. When they were arrested and brought in for questioning, the trials, informal at first, were spectacles. The girls screamed in court, flailed on the ground, claiming the accused was stabbing them with invisible knives. It didn't matter that the evidence was invisible. To many, the emotion felt real, and that was enough. Then something unexpected happened. Tituba confessed. Tituba didn't just say she was a witch. She gave a performance, an elaborate tale of flying through the air, of black dogs and a tall man in dark clothes who forced her to sign his book. She claimed there were more witches hiding in Salem, many more. Why did she confess? Perhaps she was coerced. Perhaps she knew it might spare her life. Perhaps she was trying to give the Puritans exactly what they wanted, a story that fit their fears. Either way, it worked. The hysteria exploded. Suddenly anyone could be a witch. What began as whispers turned into a community-wide panic. Neighbours turned on each other, families accused relatives. Old grudges resurfaced as accusations. If your cow stopped giving milk, if your baby fell sick, if your bread didn't rise, someone had cursed you. By spring, dozens of people had been jailed. The colony's leadership established a special court to handle the flood of accusations. And what had started in one household had become a fever spreading through Essex County. This wasn't just about superstition, it was about control. In a rigid society where conformity was survival, being different was dangerous, and the trials gave people a way to reassert order by purging what they feared, but the cost was enormous. In the coming months, innocent people would hang, families would be torn apart, and all because of a moment in one household, a moment when fear became contagious. This is how the Salem Witch Trials began, not with magic, but with a cold winter, a strict religion, a divided community, and 2 little girls who screamed in the dark. It's spring now in Salem Village, 1692. The frost is thawing, but fear still hangs heavy in the air. The townsfolk gather in anxious clusters, whispering about the devil's work. Everyone knows someone who's been accused, or jailed, or worse. But the most curious and terrifying thing of all, it's the children who are running the show. It began with Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. Then it spread like wildfire to others. Anne Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard, among others. All girls, all young, some as young as 11. In a world where children were expected to be silent, obedient, and invisible, these girls were suddenly centre stage. Everyone hung on their every word. When they entered the courtroom, it wasn't with meekness. It was with drama. They screamed, they convulsed, they claimed to see spectres, ghostly doubles, of the accused tormenting them. They wailed that invisible claws were ripping at their skin. Sometimes they mimicked the exact movements of the accused, as if controlled by some dark power. To the people of Salem, these were not performances. They were proof. The court accepted a new and dangerous kind of testimony, spectral evidence. If a girl said she saw your spectre choking her in a dream or biting her in court, that was admissible as proof of guilt. There didn't need to be physical evidence. No cauldron, no broomstick, no black cat. Just a vision. And so the accusations began to snowball. It wasn't just outcasts like Tituba and Sarah Good anymore. Now it was church-going women, respected men, even a former minister. no one was safe. One girl would cry out, and another would echo her. They fed off one another's fear, or maybe their power, because suddenly these girls who'd once been nobodies were now arbiters of life and death. Let's talk about Anne Putnam Jr., one of the most active accusers. She was just 12 years old, but her family, the Putnams, had a lot to gain. The Putnams were locked in bitter land disputes with several neighbours, and it just so happened that many of the people Anne accused were connected to those feuds. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe Anne was being used, or maybe she understood, even as a child, how much power she had when she screamed in court. Years later, long after the trials had ended, Anne would stand up in church and publicly apologise. She confessed that she had been deluded by Satan and begged forgiveness for accusing innocent people. But by then it was too late. Her words had already helped send 20 people to their deaths. Historians still debate this question. Some believe the girls were victims of mass hysteria, a psychological phenomenon where intense stress causes physical symptoms. Others suggest it was a kind of trauma response. Many of these girls were orphans or servants who had witnessed violence or lived through war. Mercy Lewis, for instance, had seen her parents killed in a native raid in Maine. Then there's the theory of attention and agency. For once, these girls were being listened to. They were being believed. In a world that rarely gave children a voice, especially girls, they were suddenly the most powerful people in the colony. And once the show began, how could they stop? Inside the courtroom, the trials became spectacles. Imagine sitting on a wooden bench as the accused pleads their innocence. Suddenly the girls across the room begin to scream. They point. They clutch their throats. One falls to the floor in a seizure. Another claims she sees the accused turning into a bird and flying toward her. The judges, grim men in black robes, nod solemnly. For them, this was not theatre. This was divine evidence. The accused, bewildered, would shout, "I am innocent!" But their pleas were drowned out by the wails of the afflicted. And the more dramatic the girls' behaviour, the more credible they seemed. One of the most shocking moments came with the arrest of Rebecca Nurse. She was 71 years old, a respected, pious woman. She had 8 children and was beloved in the community. If someone like her could be accused, no one was safe. In court, the girls cried that her spirit tormented them, even as Rebecca knelt and prayed. Her own sister, Sarah Cloyce, was also accused. Her brothers tried desperately to defend her, even gathering dozens of signatures attesting to her character. But it was no use. Rebecca was found guilty and hanged. The afflicted girls were never punished, never interrogated, never challenged in court. They were believed completely. That blind faith, combined with fear, superstition, and the social tension of a struggling colony, created a runaway train of accusations that couldn't be stopped. In total, over 200 people were accused. Some were released. Some rotted in jail. Others, innocent, terrified and bewildered, met their end on Gallows Hill, all because a group of young girls cried, "Witch!" In the end, the devil that haunted Salem wasn't the horned creature from their sermons. It was something much more human. It was fear. It was manipulation. It was the terrifying power of accusation, and how easily it can spiral out of control when belief outweighs reason. When children held power in Salem, the consequences were not childish. They were deadly. You're standing in a dim, musty jail cell in Salem, Massachusetts. The air is thick with mildew. the straw beneath your feet damp. You haven't eaten properly in days. You are one of the accused, and your trial is about to begin. You know what's waiting for you in the courthouse. Not justice, but theatre. Not evidence, but accusation. And no matter how many times you say you're innocent, you've seen what happens to people who say the same. You're not afraid of the devil. You're afraid of the court. In May 1692, Massachusetts Governor William Phips established a special court to deal with the chaos, the Court of Oyer and Termina, meaning to hear and determine. He appointed William Stoughton as Chief Justice. Stoughton was a hardline Puritan with little legal experience, but an unshakable belief that witches were real. The court was given broad authority. It did not follow standard English legal procedure. Hearsay was allowed. Spectral evidence, testimony that the ghost or shape of the accused had attacked someone, was treated as fact. In this courtroom, logic did not rule. Fear did. From the very first trial, the accused stood little chance. They were not allowed legal counsel. They were presumed guilty. Their neighbours and even family members often testified against them. The afflicted girls would perform in court, claiming to be pinched, clawed, or choked. They screamed that they saw the accused spirit flying or transforming into animals. Sometimes they fell to the floor, writhing and shrieking. The court took this as divine confirmation. The accused might be stripped and examined for witches' marks, moles, scars, or skin blemishes said to be teats for feeding imps or demons. Even a birthmark could be damning. If you confessed, you might be spared. If you denied it, you risked death. Some people, desperate to live, confessed to impossible crimes, flying through the air, signing the devil's book, consorting with animals that spoke in human voices. These confessions fueled the panic. If one person admitted to being a witch, surely their neighbour might be one too. One of the most tragic and brutal cases was Giles Corey, an elderly farmer whose wife, Martha, had been accused. When Giles himself was charged, he refused to enter a plea. He understood that if he said guilty, he'd be executed. But if he said not guilty and was found guilty, his land would be taken from his family. So Giles said nothing. To force a plea, the court used peine forte dure, pressing with heavy stones. They stripped him naked, placed him in a pit, laid a board across his chest, and piled heavy rocks on top. As the sheriff demanded a plea, Giles only muttered, "More weight." He died after 2 days of torture. He never entered a plea, and so legally his property passed to his sons, not the state. His defiance became legendary, but it also showed just how far the court was willing to go. In total, 19 people were hanged between June and September of 1692, 14 women and 5 men. They were brought by cart to Gallows Hill, a barren slope just outside town. The executions were public. People gathered to watch. None of the condemned were burned. That's a common myth. In the English colonies, hanging was the method of execution for witchcraft. Before each hanging, the victims were allowed to speak. Some prayed, some forgave their accusers, some cursed the court. Rebecca Nurse, the elderly, devout woman accused earlier, stood calmly and quietly before her execution. Her final words, "Lord, forgive them." To this day, many believe she was the very embodiment of Christian faith, hanged by a society that had lost its way. While the hangings made headlines, the jails were another kind of hell. Over 150 people were imprisoned on witchcraft charges. The jails were overcrowded and filthy. Rats scurried through straw bedding. Disease spread. There was barely enough food or water. At least 5 people died in jail, including Sarah Osborne, one of the first accused who never made it to trial. Pregnant women were not spared. Elizabeth Proctor was convicted and sentenced to death, but her execution was postponed until after childbirth. Her baby saved her life, at least temporarily. Even children weren't immune. Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, was accused of being a witch. When questioned, she spoke of a snake her mother had given her, a likely misunderstanding, but the court saw it as proof of a familiar spirit. Dorothy was imprisoned for months. When she was finally released, she was never the same. Witnesses said she had gone mad. Her mother, Sarah, was hanged in July. As she stood at the gallows, she looked at the Reverend Nicholas Noyes and declared, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Years later, Noyes would die from choking on his own blood. By the fall of 1692, the panic began to collapse under its own weight. Governor Phipps, alarmed by the number of executions and the fact that even his own wife was being whispered about, ordered the court dissolved. A new court was created, this time rejecting spectral evidence. The tide turned. Many were released. Some confessed they had lied under pressure. But for the dead, there would be no justice. The Salem Witch Trials weren't just a tragedy of superstition. They were a catastrophe of law. They showed how justice can be twisted by fear, how rules can be rewritten to fit a narrative, and how quickly a courtroom can become an execution chamber when guilt is assumed and evidence is thrown aside. Salem's trials remind us that the law is only as strong as the people who uphold it. And in 1692, the people failed. It's early 1693. The hangings have stopped. The jail doors creak open. The shrieking in the courtroom has faded to whispers. The people of Salem are left with ashes, of lives, reputations, and trust. The question that now echoes through the colony is simple and terrifying. How did this happen? Governor William Phipps, after months of escalating panic, dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. He created a new court that rejected spectral evidence. Overnight, the flood of executions stopped. Accusations were suddenly viewed with suspicion, not certainty. But the damage had already been done. 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, 5 dead in jail, 200 plus accused, countless reputations, destroyed the afflicted girls, never punished. The judges never formally tried. The public forced to reckon with the question, what had they just lived through? Some tried to make amends. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the few to publicly repent, stood in front of his congregation, bowed his head, and confessed that he had cause to fear. He had shed innocent blood. In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the lead accusers, stood before her church and admitted her role in the tragedy. She said she had been deluded by Satan, but her words, while sincere, could never bring back those she helped condemn. Others never apologized. Chief Justice William Stoughton, the man most responsible for allowing spectral evidence, showed no remorse. He died with his pride intact and his conscience untroubled. Historians have long debated what really caused the Salem Witch Trials. It wasn't just superstition. The truth is more complex and more human. Here are the leading theories. 1. Religious zeal and Puritanism. Puritanism was strict, unforgiving, and deeply fearful of the devil. Hell was not a metaphor, it was real. Satan was thought to be active, lurking behind every misfortune. In this worldview, spiritual warfare was constant. Anyone could become a tool of the devil, and women, especially outspoken, independent, or non-conforming women, were often seen as especially vulnerable to temptation. The Salem Trials were the logical extreme of this belief system, a society so convinced of its own moral purity that it could not recognize its own cruelty. 2. Personal vendettas and land disputes. Some of the accusations were clearly driven by property conflicts and old feuds. The Putnam family accused multiple people with whom they had land disputes. Many of the executed owned valuable farmland that was quickly scooped up after their deaths. When law and religion blur, personal grievances can be disguised as righteousness. Salem wasn't just a witch hunt. It was sometimes a land grab. 3. Political instability and fear. The trials didn't happen in a vacuum. Massachusetts was under political pressure. The colony's charter had been revoked and only recently restored. There had been Native American attacks on the frontier. Many of the afflicted girls were refugees or orphans from these conflicts. The trauma they carried may have fueled their behaviour. In a time of deep uncertainty and instability, the community turned inward, looking for someone to blame. 4th, ergot poisoning. One of the more unusual theories is ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye grain. If consumed, it can cause hallucinations, spasms, and delirium, symptoms similar to those shown by the afflicted girls. Could bad bread have sparked the panic? Most historians now doubt this theory. The symptoms weren't consistent, and they spread far too socially rather than geographically. It's more likely that fear and suggestion, not fungus, were to blame. Why did the afflicted girls do what they did? Some may have believed they were truly bewitched. Others may have been seeking attention, power, or escape from trauma. Still others may have been manipulated by adults around them. What's clear is that in a society where girls were meant to be silent, submissive, and unseen, they suddenly became powerful. They could speak, cry, point, and the whole world would listen. Power is intoxicating, and sometimes it can be deadly. Salem was not the largest witch hunt in history, not by a long shot. Tens of thousands were executed for witchcraft in Europe over the centuries, but Salem haunts us because it happened in early America, in a supposedly civilized Christian colony, because it revealed how easily law can be warped by fear, because it showed us that belief, left unchecked by reason, can become a weapon, and perhaps because it still happens. Today, we may not burn witches, but we still hold trials in the court of public opinion. We still accuse, assume guilt, and destroy reputations with whispers. The tools have changed, but the machinery of panic, fear, blame, and silence remains. Salem is more than a cautionary tale. It is a mirror. It reminds us that the line between justice and vengeance is thin, that the people most certain they are right can be the most dangerous, that hysteria doesn't require proof, just permission, and it teaches us that truth is not always louder than fear, but it must be fought for, even when the mob is roaring. And that concludes tonight's story. Thank you so much for being here with me today. Sleep well.